Hello, and welcome to SSC 120, American National Government Lecture on Congress. This opens up Module 3. And here we go. We have our usual study guide questions. There's going to be 15 of them. And we do have an essay on Congress supervising the executive branch that I'll get into a little bit later. So it is the dawn of a new Congress after the 2016 election and then the 2018 mid-election results. And study guide question number 1, what term best describes the current politics of U.S. Congress? Well, that answer is dysfunctional. It is a group of bitterly partisan debate that cannot come together to govern this country on key issues. It is a constant money-raising machine with tons of interest groups, and people, frankly, are pretty tired of Congress and want to see action out of them. Keyword here, dysfunctional. Congress spent most of the Constitutional Convention working on Congress. They saw it as the primary body of government, and they created, as we discussed in the first module, enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8, as well as implied powers, like the ability to have the banking system. There are constraints on Congress, and some of those constraints are in international affairs. We're also going to talk about representation in Congress and can Congress solve our big problems? So as I said, Article 1, Section 8 is where we find the list of things that Congress can do. And that list has grown longer over the years because they can imply things from it. And that would be, they call it the elastic clause or the necessary and proper clause. And these are the implied powers that Congress has. Now, the constraints on Congress. Well, they cannot pass ex post facto laws. They can't make something against the law after the fact that it happened. So you can't say today something's legal, but tomorrow we pass a law, we're going to arrest you for what you did today. Cannot hand out titles of nobility. Should not be suspending habeas corpus, which is the right of someone to go before a judge. And of course, we have the Bill of Rights of people's life, liberty, property, due process of law. Bills of attainder, by the way, were the ability to take people's lands at a moment's notice. We have, though, gone towards bicameralism. What form of legislature resulted from the compromise of the 1787 Constitutional Convention? A unicameral legislature is a one-body legislature. Bicameral, like a bicycle, a two-body. One, the House, based upon population, and the other, the Senate, 2 per state. They also have constrained by the veto. It only takes a majority to pass a law, but if the president vetoes it, that majority turns into a supermajority to override it, and now you're talking 2/3. And then, of course, the courts can interpret Congress's law against the Constitution in the power of judicial review. Now, basis for representation of Congress. So we had the Virginia and New Jersey plans looking at population and per state, and then the Connecticut Compromise, which created the bicameral. In terms of election, the one closest to the people, the House, 435 members elected every 2 years. I say that with deliberation because you're constantly running a campaign that way. The Senate, on the other hand, originally picked by the state legislatures, Constitution was amended to pick them by popular vote, but 1/3 of the Senate is elected each election cycle, 2 years, and so third, the Senate's terms are 2 times 3 or 6 years. So senators serve for 6 years, and literally you have this mix and match, every House member every 2 years, a president every 4 years, 1/3 of the Senate every 2 years in 6-year terms. The 17th Amendment, 1913, is the amendment that changed Senate election to directly to the people. So the constitutional differences between the House and the Senate, I've already talked about 6 and 2 and the 1/3 rule. The total membership, 100 in the Senate, 50 states times 2, 435 in the House. And that's been the same since the census of 1910. You have to be 30 years old to be a senator, 25 to be in the House. The Senate tends to be the approver of appointments by the president. The House tends to be the budget expert, particularly on revenue. The House, for example, brings impeachment charges. The Senate would try them. Is Congress capable of solving the big problems? And the answer to that question is framers were hoping that they would, but as our countries become more complex and we've had more gridlock, basically the president becomes the de facto decision maker. I will say, however, presidents have gotten things done through Congress. Ronald Reagan got things done, Bill Clinton got things done, and Obama got things done. Representation of Congress, there's two styles. I'll actually talk about a third one in between. The demographics of who's there, reapportioning, redistricting, representation in the Senate, and then how representative is Congress to the American people. So the two styles of representation are trustee and delegate. Question number 5, what is a delegate? A delegate is someone who gets elected, goes to represent the people that chose them, and they mirror the exact views and wishes of their constituents. They mirror the views of their constituents. So polling is a critical part, or visits to local people and kind of listening to them. A trustee is more of the Republican as opposed to Democratic model. The delegate is a Democrat. You elected me, I represent you, I do your bidding. A trustee is more of a republic, a government of the people. You elect me, I study the issues, and I make my best choice because I'm the expert and I'm the one who's studying them. And number 9, what is a trustee? A trustee is someone who acts independently and trusts their own judgment as the best way to serve the public interest. And which model would you choose? Well, Congress members are both at different times, and hence we give the word politico as the in between. Some are more delegate than trustee. Here is Abraham Lincoln, as well as another famous politician, kind of laying those out. And Lincoln probably, oh, that's Edmund Burke, if I remember correctly. And Lincoln would be more of the demos, and Burke would be more the trustee. Member demographics and how are they split up and by what area? So you can see that percent of the House women is only 19%, but they're 50% of the population. Now, minorities, 12% of the population, 10.8%. Latinos, 16.3 and 6. Asians, 4.8 and 3.6. The biggest gap there is women. And here we are in the 114th Congress, the picture of the women, a whole batch of new women that got elected, many of them outsiders to the process, and many of them a thorn in the president's side. Representation in the House, reapportionment, and redistricting. So every 10 years following the census, which is done on the 10, 20, 30, 40, the population is looked at, and we're growing, but some areas grow faster than others. So we redistrict the electoral map for the Electoral College, and then inside the state, we redistrict to see who serves. Some states gain, some lose. The current trend is for the South and Southwest to gain, and then states in the Midwest, like Ohio, have lost. So here you can see Ohio in the 2010 census lost 2 seats. Texas gained 2 seats, and Florida gained 4 seats. The effects of redistricting, gerrymandering, and then majority-minority districts. So gerrymandering is a name that was given in the 1800s to creating districts that take a boundary, and this is, I believe, in Chicago, in Illinois, and move the boundary around to keep a politician safe. And so that's the gerrymander. And here is the example. It's called the Earmuff District, the fourth district in Illinois. And obviously, if those are suburbs, that number 4 would be a very good Republican district. And then number 7 would be the city. That would be a Democratic district, right? So you try to bolster your support where you can. We do have one in Ohio. And if you look at area number 5, where we are, in Henry, Defiance, Fulton, Williams, Lucas Wood, Paulding, Van Wert, Putnam, Hancock, Hardin, and a piece of Mercer. That's Bob Latta. It's a very straightforward district, and Bob Latta is our congressman. He's a Republican. It's a Republican area. But then you look at number 9, and that long yellow sliver from Lucas County all the way wraps around Lake Erie and goes all the way over to the other side. That is Marcy Kaptur's district, and that has been, I'd say, very politely gerrymandered to be able to, kind of protect certain people in certain places. If you ungerrymandered it, obviously next to it, it would look quite different. So representation of the Senate is far less complicated, and we are going to look at diversity there. And how does Congress live up to their ideal? And the election process. So the Congress takes steps to decide when to run and how to do it, and the primary and general election is how it occurs. Now, who runs for Congress? Senate seats are more visible than House seats. Senators tend to be a little more tested. They're there for 6 years. They tend to be more of a trustee than a delegate. House members often face weak challengers. You have people in the House been there a long, long time. Candidates for the House come from mayors, state legislators. Candidates for the Senate come from big cities and governors. Money and congressional elections, big deal. Lots of money from outside groups. Some self-finance campaigns, but you got to be pretty wealthy to do that. Even a regular, everyday congressional campaigns, at least $1 million today. The other part is called open seat elections, where someone has stepped down and there's no incumbent running, and that's when the money gets big and the contention, it gets hot, and you literally want to try to jump in there and scare the competition away. Look at campaign money raised by incumbents versus challengers, and look at that big 63% and 52%, whereas the challengers get 19 and 25. The money tends to back somebody who's already there because it's a proven product and they'll get the influence they desire. The incumbency factor, number 14. What advantages do incumbents possess? Well, it's substantial, and incumbents, the biggest one is the money, and the second is the name. So incumbents win a re-election 93% of the time in the House and 80% in the Senate. Incumbent means that you already hold the seat and you're running to keep it or re-elect. Reasons explained? Well, first of all, you can redistrict your seat, so the people that vote for you are all around you. A lot of the ability to raise money, as you saw from the graph. The franking privilege, that's a free postal privilege, so you can mail your constituents and inform them, quote unquote, anytime, but that basically is like free election stuff. You do lots of casework for people, that's helping individuals out, and pork, where you help your district out, maybe with an infrastructure project like a road. And if you look at rates of incumbency for reelection in Congress, you can see the House pretty high in the 90%. And then the Senate goes up and down, and that up and down is usually connected to a presidential election. Here's federal spending at work number 2. What is the dilemma of pork in legislation? Well, we need to move forward. Here's the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. We want to do these things, but every time you put millions of dollars into a local project, that drives the deficit up. So it's the expense of everyone. So progress requests or requests for one district are at the expense of all American taxpayers. So the Republicans in particular are like, no pork, no pork, no pork. Do congressional elections ensure representation? Well, we'll see. I think congressional members do a lot of things to win re-election. Ideology and party ID is probably the biggest one, and then money is the biggest thing. they may be representative from a demographic or ideological point of view, but the amount of money in it is so obscene that a handful of people with money have a lot more access than everybody else. The congressional legislative process. So for this, in our activities in class, we'll do a little fun with that one. But typically, this is the civics lesson. You introduce a bill, refer it to a committee. The Rules Committee makes the basic rules about what's going to happen. You put it out on the floor. Then you resolve any differences between the two branches. The president then signs it or doesn't sign it, and then the party and leadership influences the passage process. So the leaders really are the big deal here, the Senate Majority Leader and the House Speaker. And how a bill becomes a law, number 10, what percent of bills introduced actually get passed? That number's surprisingly low, 6%. 6% of all bills get passed. So lots of members introduce bills because they can tell their constituents, I introduced this bill. But they know from the beginning it has no chance of passage. You can send it off to your favorite committee, and the committee can just bury it, and it never comes out again. That's the fate of most legislation. And the chart here is on the dance between the House and the Senate and putting them back together and the president and how a bill becomes a law. Introducing a bill, only a member of Congress can introduce a bill, but for the most part, the bills are written by staff members and other people, sometimes interest groups. As an example, Bob Latta, our local congressman, introduced a bill, and he does this pretty frequently, to improve broadband service in rural areas, something that's very important to us. Bills can introduce either in the House or the Senate, but tax bills, money bills, start in the House. Both House and Senate have to pass a bill before it becomes a law. The bill is then referred to a committee, and there are typically standing committees that handle most of the legislation, and getting on these committees is very key. So if you lived in our area, being on the Agricultural Committee would be good. If you live in an area where there's maybe a naval base, you want to be on the Armed Services Committee. You might want to be on the Transportation Committee if your state has a lot of roads. So there are hearings by the committees. They mark up, or I would say edit the bill. The committee chair and seniority kind of dictates the rules and the flow and what happens. And typically people defer to party leadership. There's a lot of bills out there, and the leaders kind of decide which one and when. The Rules Committee, which is far more powerful in the House, determines, when you have 435 members, how long you can talk on a bill. And that gatekeeper, when it comes up, how long can you talk, how much time members have, is really a key function to decide what gets passed and what doesn't. Members typically vie for party loyalty. You vote for my bill here, and I'll help you out with money for your reelection campaign. What's happened is polarization has increased what are called closed rules, and polarization of the both parties kind of voting on the party line. So the floor action, generally easier in the House than in the Senate, and bills need a simple majority. In the Senate, it's more difficult. Each senator has more influential power because there's only 100 of them, and there's fewer limitations on debate. You can filibuster, for example, which is talk a bill to death, and then Congress can vote to cloture that filibuster. Requires usually a vote of 60 to make it stop. Here's Ted Cruz, one of the Republican candidates for president in 2016. I believe he talked for 20 hours against the ACA as it was working its way through Congress. So here again are some of the differences. House being, for example, a little more rule-bound, a little more specialized. The Senate, less specialized, more time for talk. Resolving their differences. Well, rarely does a bill come out of both houses exactly the same. So the bills are passed by each chamber. They're substantially different. And those differences are reconciled by what's called the conference committee, made up of members of both houses. And number 11 asks, what committee reconciles the differences in proposed laws by the House and Senate? And the answer is the conference committee. And that conference committee has to get a version of the law that is word for word identical, sent back to each chamber and passed. The presidential action. So once that 6%, right, it's a little bit bigger than that, but gets to the president's desk, the president can basically sign the bill. That's what happens the great bulk of the time. Occasionally, the president will not sign the bill. That, in Russian we go "Niet," and that is veto. That means I am not signing that bill. You can also pocket veto, which means if Congress is at the end of a session, you can simply do nothing and the bill will die. And the president has, I believe it's 10 working days. So there's a set of working days involved attached to this. Now, to override the veto, you need 2/3 of the vote in both houses, and that's hard to do. All right, political parties are at the core of this process, and the leadership is the Speaker of the House. Number 8, who determines who speaks, and the schedule for the U.S. House of Representatives. That's why he's called, or she is called, the Speaker of the House, because they decide who gets to talk. Powers of the Speaker have waxed and waned. They've been very, very powerful and then pulled back. I think today they are, because of the partisanship, pretty powerful. They control the party's agenda and when things happen. There's what's called a majority leader, who is the number 2, second in command. And then you have the majority whips, to whip those votes in line. Number 6, what is the main function of a congressional whip? To persuade party members to vote on the bill correctly, on the party line, toe the line. And then number 13, what are the major roles of the party whip? Well, they contact members and keep them informed of what's going on. They count the votes at all times. They know who's in and who's out. And they are a vital communication link of their party to their membership. The minority also has a leader and a whip, and so you have majority minority. In parliamentary government, this is where the bulk of the action is. In Congress, this is where some of the action is. Now, parties get together and talk and decide things amongst themselves. And when a party gets together amongst themselves, it is a caucus. Number 3 says, who staged a revolt against congressional committee systems in 1974? Well, committee systems were done by long-standing seniority. And the Democrats in 1974, after the tumult of 1968 and the Vietnam War protest, had lots of new members, and they wanted to be on committees. So they literally revolted and rebuilt the system. So that's the Democratic caucus in 1974. And then number 15, what occurs at the first party caucus after an election? So you have an election in the House, 435 members, many of them the same, but you still got to go it again. And so what happens is at the first caucus, the party picks its leaders and assigns committees, picks its leaders and assigns committees. For example, the Democrats have Nancy Pelosi, and I believe she's probably more at the end of her time, but she, really is the stalwart to face up to the Republicans. In the Senate, it's Mitch McConnell, I think, is the main figure, and then of course the House. So the Nancy Pelosi in the House versus Donald Trump as president is a big clash all the time. Leadership in the Senate, little less formal. The Senate Majority Leader is pretty influential, but not as much as the House Speaker. And the Minority Leader does play an important role. They have the ability to kind of persuade, I think, smaller numbers of people to work with. Congress voting, party and party line, procedure, substantive, and then how we do the differences. So political parties are glues for Congress and why we keep voting on party lines. So here's party voting in Congress. If you look at the chart, that chart goes up, doesn't it? Yes. Percent of Democrats, percent of Republicans voting on party lines is now over 90%. So congressional oversight. I believe this would be the essay number 1. What are the 3 main methods of congressional oversight? Well, first, the purpose of oversight is to ensure that our laws are properly executed. Congress passes a law, we want the bureaucracy and other people to carry it out. And it also will look for abuses of people, skimming money or doing something for power and influence. So the 3 main methods of that oversight are nominating confirmations. That is, the president nominates people to over 2,000, I believe, in the bureaucracy, and the Senate typically confirms them. So that's one way. The second are hearings and investigations. So Congress can look into a particular subject matter, and that, since the Democrats have a little stronger control in the House, and Donald Trump tweets things out. That back and forth on hearings and investigations, like the famous Mueller report, has been quite the political battle. And then, number three, impeach. So you ever see in the news every now and then, impeach Trump. It's very difficult to do. A few have tried and not gotten there. Andrew Johnson, post-Civil War, Nixon, and then Clinton are all been involved in the impeachment process. The nominating committee ensures that people are properly qualified. The Senate does this, and this gets particularly contentious around the Supreme Court. Hearings and investigations, and so some examples, Watergate with Nixon, Iran-Contra affair, and Benghazi, which was something that Hillary Clinton was involved in. So this increases party control, increases when party control and government is divided. So here's the public whipping of, I believe these are automakers, like, why are you up here? And they, this is very typical of people were mad at financial institutions and mad at the auto industries for TARP and the bailouts. So their chief executives had to show up. These are usually men of long standing who are used to a lot of power, and they're not very happy about getting hauled in front of Congress. Impeachment. House has the impeachment responsibility, and then Senate tries it. It's only been used once against a bureaucrat, a handful of times against judges, and no president has ever been removed. Andrew Johnson fell short by a few votes. Nixon was about to be impeached. I think there were votes for a trial in the Senate, and he resigned. And Clinton, again, lived out, the Senate could never get enough votes to make that work. So here's our interactive exercise, and you're looking at Bob Latta here, who came. He's very good about visiting his constituents. And Colin Doolittle showing a hand. That little hand right there is made for a young man in our district by one of our 3D printers. And Bob's looking at our little race car and our student clubs, and Bob is the representative of the 5th District. I've also mentioned Marcy Kaptur, who is the 9th District in that kind of convoluted district. And here are all of the representatives in the area. When I lived in Cleveland and worked there, I was very familiar with Marcia Fudge. I'll mention, she was a super delegate, so I will mention a little bit of that. Troy Balderson, that was a very contentious election. Tim Ryan, another, Democrat in a more safer space. And then David Joyce, not someone that I've known and met a few times. He's where I lived in Summit County. So Steve Shabbat, for example, has been a member since 2011. I knew Steve when he was on Cincinnati City Council when I was working at the University of Cincinnati. So it's a good group. They're known as a group who works together and across the aisles. And that's all I've got. I'm just checking it out for the study guide here. I think I've covered everything. I did mention in number 7, since 1910, how many members are elected? 435. Number 8, who determines who speaks? The speaker. I think I'm just looking at it. Number 12, packing and cracking are methods of gerrymandering. And we'll talk a little bit more about packing and cracking, which are ways to push people into a district and make sure they're all of the same party. So I think I've covered, it looks like I've covered all the study guide questions and the 3 methods of oversight. I believe the essay question talks about Brett Kavanaugh, so I would encourage you to read on that, and we'll talk more about it in class. And so with that, we are done with our lecture on Congress.